Hello, my name is Toby Fitch, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the place I'm speaking from, the Wiradjuri people whose land was never ceded.
I'm Ellen van Neerven, and I'm on unceded Yagara and Turrbal land. We are the co-editors of Best of Australian Poems, a new annual anthology collecting previously published and unpublished poems to create a poetic snapshot of the year that was.
Best of Australian Poems 2021 is the first anthology of what Australian Poetry, the national poetry organisation, hopes will be a long-standing series. Since Black Ink's well-regarded Best Australian Poems series concluded in 2017, Australian Poetry found there was interest among both poets and readers in the idea of a new annual series.
What BOAP aims to do is collect together some of the best, most interesting, most challenging work by Australian poets over a 12-month timeframe, in this case July 2020 to June 2021, and by doing so, chart the waves and currents of each passing year. This anthology features 100 poems by 100 poets across a range of poetic voices, approaches, and themes. Soon we will hear from 10 of these poets.
As part of this anthology, we've included one poet who's no longer with us. In September 2020, one of Australia's great performance poets and teachers of poetry, Ania Walwicz, died. Born in Poland in 1951 and emigrating to unceded Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung lands in 1963, her distinctive voice and work embodied a migrant perspective of her adopted Australia, or as she called it in one of her poems, the Big Ugly, through experimental prose and uncanny performances. She was a sound poet who took many of her cues from experimental music, and while her influence will be felt into the future, the loss of her anarchic, feminist, Dada alter egos now leaves a gap in the Australian poetry community.
Ania Walwicz wrote, "The act of writing is an oral event." In our curation, we held this in mind, the responsibility of curating 100 oral events for this poetry anthology. It's been a pleasure working with you on this anthology, Toby, over the last 6 months. We've had many Zoom calls and emails over this period, firstly making our selections and then building the book. Would you like to say anything about this experience?
Well, it's been a pleasure working with you too, Ellen. And yeah, I found it really rewarding to read the huge variety of poetry being written at the moment. There are so many different types of poems in the anthology, and because we've tried to capture that polyphony. And we've also included quite a few excellent long poems, which isn't something these annual Best of series have always been able to cater for. But what has been probably even more interesting to me is the breadth of subjects that the poems cover and how so many of the poems are cognizant of the various crises we currently find ourselves in. And the poems tend to deal with the current moment personally and locally. Poems about family, mortality, and travel, or lack of. What other kinds of poems are there in there?
Yeah, also poems about science, historical events, the idea of history repeating itself. Poems that critique or challenge colonialism, racism, the patriarchy, capitalism, and other systems of power.
And there are some poems touching on religion, spirituality, and mythology, poems about the body, expressions of gender, poems that repurpose public language and discourse.
The other thing I noticed is that there's some poems that look inward about a particular memory or feelings, and poems that look outward to politics, climate change, poems about plants and animals and our relationships with them. And then, of course, poems about fire and poems about the pandemic.
Yeah, and while we were drawn to topical poems like those, as this is an anthology of a very specific time period, the ones that stood out to us managed to balance timeliness with timelessness, form with technique, or they alluded to the matter at hand rather than spell it out. Certainly a place for poems that did not mince words.
We are about to hear from 10 poets reading from their contribution to the anthology. But firstly, we have some acknowledgements to make. We'd like to thank our 100 poets for capturing the year that was. We'd like to thank the Australia Council for the Arts and Creative Victoria for funding this anthology. We'd also like to thank the Wheeler Centre for supporting the launch and for being a great supporter of poetry in general. We would like to thank AP, particularly Jacinta LaPlastria, Emma Kasky, and designer Sophie Gore, working across massive time differences, for all their work assisting in the making of this book. It has been a privilege to read and consume so much intense and wonderful poetry, and we hope readers will find poems in this anthology that inspire, provoke, and challenge their understanding of the world and of poetry itself.
I second all those thank yous. Now it's time to hear 10 of the poems from the book. In the following order, Sara M Saleh will read her poem Border Control, Meditations. John Kinsella will read his poem Exoskeletons. Jana Perković will read her poem My Fathers Tell Me of Water. Jill Jones will read Possible Manners of Revelation. Rico Craig will read his poem Spare Keys. Ouyang Yu will read Advice to a Translator of Australian Poetry. Judith Crispin will read on Finding Charlotte in the Anthropological Record. Shastra Deo will read How to Love Like a Horse. Manisha Anjali will read Nausea. And Yeena Kirkbright will finish this event off with her poem Mnemonic 2020. We hope you enjoy these poems from Best of Australian Poems 2021.
My name is Sara Saleh, and I will be reading my poem, Border Control Meditations. The questions two young soldiers asked me at the King Hussein border crossing checkpoint. Were you born on a Thursday in Cleopatra Hospital? Did you come out silently as daybreak smudged the night sky, and why was your father absent? What is the name of your father and his father and his father? Do your neighbors Muhammad and Fatuma water the orphaned houseplant whenever you are away? Are you aware your parents first arrived in Australia with their life savings wrapped in brown paper, their only English the lyrics to We Are the Champions? Did your mother bring two dresses, red polka dot and turquoise taffeta in her peeling 60s suitcase? Did you correct her thanks God? Did she put up a fight when you said you were leaving, when he left? And how was your first Ramadan alone? Did you miss the walnut ma'mool and Allahu Akbar's tossed at you Eid morning? Have you told anyone about the Enid Blyton books you stole from Stanmore Library because your mother worked 3 jobs? If you flatten your gutturals, is it still Arabic? Why did your childhood best friend run away? What man siphoned her dry? And why does your grief stick to everything? Did inhaling an onion help with the tear gas they threw during the protests of '03? What remedies did you inherit from your ancestors? What skeletons? Who taught you to roll wara anab like that? Does 2 a.m. still grab you by the throat? Amongst the gitanes and sewage and Roman ruins, can Beirut forgive its people? How many times have you phoned your mother since? Does your grandmother always boil her water twice, and why are you still shocked at how things don't work there? What other city turns its war bunkers into clubs, its prayers into curses, and why do the wretched always sell roses on Bliss Street? And how do you revive the dead? Why did they take your brother? Could you make out his face amongst the thousands flickering in the waters of the Mediterranean? Did he return months after the funeral to ask you, what wrongs did I commit? What village do you carry on your lips? Balance on your breath? Have you been to Jerusalem during olive harvest season? Did you pick and press before the settlers gathered like acid in your chest and poisoned the ancient trees? Have you tired yet of their may Allah have mercies? Have they tired of you? Were you afraid of the men with guns those nights the power cut? Did you splutter your amens and sweat out your tasabih? Do you remember the countries you've lost? Do their crooked rivers still cling to you? Did you hear the auntie's rusted arms, coarse hairs on chins call you lonely? Call you nobody's mama anymore? Did you tell your mama you named him Omar al-Farouk after the revered warrior? Why did it end with your great love who changed everything? Did he make your wide hips tremble with jazz and dirbekke? Did he linger long enough on each letter of Yalel, Ya'ain, and the evening news headlines? Did your hurts trail behind him like tangled fishing lines too much for the life he lived? And does weight like that settle or lift? And what of the days you feel the earth graying? And when will you stop writing about borders and bloodshed and war and death and home and home and home?
Hi, I'm John Kinsella, speaking from Baladong Noongar Budja, near the borders of Wajak and Yuad Noongar Budjas. I'm going to read the poem Exoskeletons. Words are less inherently appealing, less appealing inherently, only as skin needing to graft extra senses, though likely that's too harsh an abrasive rub of wild oats and seed spikes through socks wandering the routes of machine to home usage. Chains of command that take and give, but mainly take, all falling before the trimmer cable flayed out of speech. The whole frame shudders and vibrates, though fingers don't ease the ache of hinges. To work with or against the gradient is semantics for microclimates. A metal eyelet lost on a hillside enacts self-protection to deport as raw material and not object as commodity one step closer to origins and answer. I search futility. Walking a steep incline, friendship is never closer or further than slipping back into one's own footmarks. Holds let go one by one as subject tracing a journey that can't begin. All of the seed falling and so much needed and unwanted. The scattering of figuratives to make greenhouses of silos rather than places of storage. Contra excursives. It's like that turning of year at higher revolutions, that fling of covers. Similes were invented as a way in or a way out, a relief or substitute from labour. Cuts, calluses, a trapdoor spider pulling back as I approach. But I, you, we, will go round in circuits, its ambit and orbit, its influence where crossing over is to be stung and dragged down, dissolved and supped on. Exoskeletons, invertebrate refrain till the interior pushed back into light collapses and compresses, which is the powerhouse of geo and orbit by a state of health to reclaim body or soul and yet let go of that claim on first aid or medicaments, exercising rites of passage and abode as substitutes for conscience.
Hi there, my name is Jana Perković. I'm a Bosnian Australian writer, poet and critic, currently based or stuck, one or the other, in Berlin, speaking to you today from my bedroom in Schöneberg. The poem that I'm about to read is written in part about a conversation I had something like 20 years ago when I was living in so-called Perth on the unceded lands of the Wajak people of Noongar Budja. I want to take a moment to recognise their continued connection to the lands and waters around so-called Perth, and to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. I pay my respect to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples listening. I also want to mention that the Noongar name for the river that I refer to as the Swan in this poem is Derbal Yarrigan. My fathers tell me of water. My father tells me, all rain that falls in Bosnia flows into the Black Sea, and every storm that shakes Herzegovina bleeds into the Adriatic. Only he says this in Bosnian, says Kisha, Pada, Oluya, Voda. He tells me that our river is the Neretva, and points a vague north to where our Rijeka is born, traces a sketch of her course through the air and tells me I can swim her to Hrvatska, to the sea. He takes me swimming where she peels herself into Jablaničko jezero, shows me the streamlets that race by our house to meet her, and the pipes that lead her back to rush ice cold from our tap. My father tells me each drop that spills over Perth is a precious thing in need of saving for the parched earth, the listless wheat and fire-hungry bush, the cloudless future and all the coming thirst. He tells me that this river is the Swan, that she is not ours, but something taken and awash in blood, hemmed in and straining, and the least we can do is let the grass grow brown. He takes me swimming where the salt crusts our limbs, dries in crystals across uneven tides, and explains to me the power you need to turn the sea fresh, make her run sweet and warm from our tap.
Hi everyone, Jill Jones here. I'm reading from Ghana land, and I want to acknowledge the Ghana people, the traditional custodians and original songmakers of this place, and to especially acknowledge their elders, past, present and future. I'd also like to thank Ellen and Toby for choosing my poem for this anthology, Australian Poetry for the great idea of a new annual poetry anthology, and the Willis Centre for hosting this event. The poem of mine in the anthology is called Possible Manners of Revelation, which is from my most recent book, Wild Curious Air, published late last year. Possible Manners of Revelation. I translate roses as multiples, a rose and a rose and a rose. I paint all my corners different colours. I welcome my own redundancies and all that time to kill. I resurrect the dead for a second when I close my eyes. I slide that agnostic load from my shoulders in a flash of unearthing. I face east, then west, to respect my indirection. I swallow the moonlight and hope it may ward off the sincere and embarrassing shadows I've shed. I return to multiples. I alphabetise my dreams, hoping for order. I set fire to my opinions and wait for the truce. I find lost amulets in the gutter, left by cyclists or the stars, and bless them again with unchanged secrets. I strike light into the dark passage where the summer moths return. I forget my body is what I have with me until my fingers and breath do their work. I tinker with the time it takes to remember. I remember everyone I forgot. I promise the invisible I will return one day. I lean against the transcendent, listening to the honey-eaters fight in the camellias. I talk to absence like the one who has gone. I ask emptiness to fill me. I deface all my damage because the world won't forgive me. I recite a history of my own breath, which is the poem.
Hi, my name's Rico Craig. I'll be reading a poem called Spare Keys from my latest collection, Our Tongues Are Songs. In the future, my daughter will love, and that will be enough. Blood will flow under her skin, the hounding daily news will be a source of fleeting fear. She will concoct plans to upend this world. Her friends will message too much, they will carry discontent far into the future. It will be temporarily glorious. We will say goodbye through car windows as we rush to other people and places, and it will be enough. Every message she sends will be without punctuation, and if I read them closely, they will run together There will be a procession of days, and even a single word will be enough. One day, she will come to me asking for spare keys to her flat. I'll find them in my drawer. We'll walk over to her place. On the way, we'll talk about the nights we spent bound to bad television, waiting for B-listers to reveal scores. Really, we'll be talking about something else. We'll be saying, "I'm well. How are you?" We'll be hovering around each other with memories. I'll be using my right hand to shade the sun. She'll be wearing sunglasses, and it will be enough to pretend I'm too lazy to walk up her stairs. She'll appear at the window above and call my name. I'll edge around and wait for her to drop the keys in my hands. Cars will pass on the street behind me. This will be true and possible. She will wave from the window. She will say, "See you later." A bus will pass. Somewhere a tree will grow new leaves. Uncountable trees and their uncountable leaves, learning to live again, learning to fill us with their air. I will wait, looking up as she draws back through the open window. I will think of the endless shades of green, all the edges of leaves, fronds, needles, making their way into the world, and it will be enough. It will help us to breathe.
Advice to a translator of Australian poetry. You wanted me to make some recommendations to you as to whose poetry in Australia is interesting enough to be translated into Chinese. I'm not sure whether you are more interested in the past or the present. Take the present, okay? They are big names, of course, but you don't start with them, or else you get stuck with them. Start with small things that have never been published, that are never allowed into print. Oh yes, what do you think Australia is? Paradise? There is censorship, believe me, about as bad as China and anywhere else. The only difference is they have a different name for it. They call it standards or quality. But you know what I call it? I call it mediocrity, whose name is Australian poetry. Avoid at any cost publications by major publishers who don't know a thing about how to handle poetry except as a marketing product, and whose main concern is the name. You still want the names? You don't need me to tell you. They are there in every recent anthology. They are in the Oxford Companion of Austerlit, or the Cambridge Hist of Austerlit. Those who take up more pages than others. Ask yourself these questions. Why the others are never there? The other, that is. And if there ever is an anthology of unpublished Australian poetry, a history of Australian literary exclusions and absences, why the worst still sits on top and shits on others, the other, that is. You still need the names? I'm not a name dropper, although I think I know a lot of them. Save it for posterity. Recommendations I don't have. Not ever. And perhaps the only one I ever have is this. Find whatever that appeals to you at first sight, like love, and discard the rest which is too much these days. Bear in mind, though, that poetry doesn't make money. Even in a multi-modern, post-cultural, colonial second-class country. Or go to a poet or critic at Melbourne Uni.
This poem is called On Finding Charlotte in the Anthropological Record. We meet on the surface of a photograph, as a fish and bird might meet in a lake, at a point of sky and the water's plain. Charlotte, in a book called The Aborigines of Northern Victoria, sits jade black on earth, wind disarranging her hair. Trees obscured by falls of campfire ash, her nudity is covered by a blanket. I don't know if her breasts are hanging, if her thighs bear designs or marks. A needlework of scars crosses her chest, repeated dots like patterns on a goanna's back, like rain spat by goannas into dirt. Soon constellations will appear over branches on this night of 90 years ago, this never again night, and she asks me, "Where did you go, girl, with your made-up history, your ever whiter babies?" This is what remains, a record of relatedness, scars to hold the memory of someone precious after they've died. We begin by cutting skin, rub wounds with gum and ash, black ants to cauterize the flesh. I remember them telling me, "Don't worry, this blackness fades with each generation." Charlotte is a map of a country stained by massacres, Skull Creek, Poison Well, Black Gin's Leap. A geography of skin and land, maps for the returning, for those who speak only a murderer's tongue, whose songlines are erased, who consulted departments of births, deaths, and marriages, who stood beside rented Toyotas clutching photographs in 100 remote communities, asking strangers, "Do you know my family? Can you tell me who I am?" This moment, an old light is crossing the boundaries of emulsion, and I say to her, "Charlotte, grandmother of my grandfather, I am Judith, and these are my scars."
I live, work, and write on the stolen land of the Yagara and Turrbal people. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and future, and to the first storytellers and first poets of this country. Thank you to Ellen van Neerven, Toby Fitch, and Australian Poetry for selecting me for this anthology. And thank you also to Stacey Teague and Scum Magazine for publishing this poem in the first instance. How to Love Like a Horse, after Mindy Gill's A Kind of Paradise. What I know about desire is horses who aren't hungry can't be owned by anyone. The horse, she bows to no one. Well, she bows only for bribe, wheedle, and charm, only for a patch of fresh clover or an apple to chomp to pieces. A horse is a good thing to think on when I can't speak neatly, our jaws working in tandem. And maybe she bows to carry you from there to wherever the earth allows us to walk, to my fetlocks, knowing that to love is to sometimes keep one's feet off the ground, and to look on a horizon is to see only the past. A horse is a good place to be, strategically. And here I am understanding that horses know to wait for their happiness. The swing of a muzzle into the chest of her beloved, a hand muscling in at the withers, that big horse heart at rest, eating the clover at dusk, knowing the next day will be twice as lucky.
Nausea. I am watering myself in the dark. I am pulling the hairs out of my throat, one by one. This is how I look for cavities. When a hair is broken at the end, it is a fracture in the consciousness of the skull it grew from. If a hair sits still in the throat, it will reincarnate as a soapy fish. If it rides like a wavy snake, it is neither here nor there, like an artist or a philosopher. If it pulls out easily, it wants to overthrow the government. Every time we laugh, paper birds fly out of our mouths and out the open window and into the pink air and into the realm of flowers. We are swimming in the milky watercolor pond. Tadpoles are flowering into frogs. The frogs are growing old but not aging. We are eating lilies the way we always do in dreams. I am pulling hairs out of my throat and grating them into our flowers for more flavor. I want more flavor because I need confirmation of my existence. I want more flavor because I am insatiable. I want more flavor because I am never happy with what I have. I am grating my hair at 80 beats per minute. The truth about flavor is that it cannot exist unless there is a snake-shaped rhythm which can serve as a backbone for the meaning of life. Tadpoles only flower into frogs when the waters are singing in C major. The lilies we eat open their mouths and say, "Knowledge is obsolete." The birds of peace are obsolete. The frogs of peace are an octave too low. Time is moving backwards. Time is obsolete. The lilies are lying. I am milking my lungs in the watercolor light. We ate the lilies without asking permission, and now they're disseminating mistruths and double meanings in our bellies. I draw a window in the sky to alleviate my nausea. I vomit a circle of fractured hairs into the milky pond. Every time we cry, winged paper snakes grow out of our eyes and into our yellowing mosquito nets and into the tinfoil sky and into the realm of windows. The frogs of peace are an octave too low. Our consciousness is a charlatan. Like the lilies in our bellies and the hairs in our throats and the paper birds and paper snakes that grow from our laughter and our tears. Our fractured catacombs will be put back together by frogs and played like instruments. I will play you, and you will play me, and we will be born.
Yimadumering, my name is Yeena Kirkbright. Today I'm reading my poem to you from the unceded lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to Gadigal elders past and present, and to acknowledge the continuing connection and cultural authority of the Gadigal people over these lands. This was, is and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd also like to acknowledge the voice of my own Wiradjuri ancestors in this poem, Mnemonic 2020. 1. Black. Uncle takes us walking on Yuin country. He shows us overgrown bush grapevine wrestling with sarsaparilla and gums. He tells us black fellas would have burnt this back long ago if they were allowed. He makes us tea in a billy, gets told by a ranger to put it out. Fire ban. A month later, Uncle loses everything, returns home to find a half-burnt roo stumbling around. 2. Indigo. My sister and I drive from Cadigal to Naarm. Smoke shepherds us down past the bulrushes of Wodonga. We breathe blue sky for the first time in months. 3. Brown. Out where Wiradjuri and Wawan meet, marsh dries to desert. 3,000 hectares of reed beds burn. It doesn't make the 6 p.m. news. 4. Orange. A friend and I swing in hammocks up in Greenguy bush. All the grass is dead. They are feeding the paddy melon sweet potato. 5. Silver. My cousin and I go camping at New Year's. We meet where saltwater and freshwater wed on Warrami country. We bunker down as in tents as sirens pass. Lightning wreaks havoc on drought-washed hills. We prepare to evacuate. 6. Yellow. I travel with my sister to visit Mob on Biripi and Dungutty country. We eat chip sandwiches like we did as kids, with Dad in the shadows of Wollongong. We watch Nan eat lemons from the tree we sit under, while smoke from grass fires linger. 7. Purple. After the jacaranda blooms, we go into lockdown. We are locked in together on Gadigal land. I work from my bedroom and feel more trapped than ever. A manager tells me she heard an Aboriginal woman on Sky News say, "Black breathlessness isn't a problem, not in Australia." I can't argue, I need to pay bills. 8. Violet. Rio Tinto rapes Duke and George. Rio Tinto makes final dividend payment totalling $3.6 billion. Rio Tinto's share price returns to 6-month high. 9. Gold. Someone complains about doing all of Brighton. The vulnerable are Rapunzeled in towers. Essential workers are scared of hunger, too scared to tell managers they live with a positive case. 10. Red. UCID calls cops on student protest of less than 20. UCID's Vice-Chancellor increases number of students in tutorials to 30. Hundreds of students return to protest at UCID. 11. White. I travel with my cousin to Seal Rocks. We camp by melting white Warrami shores. All the seals are lost. We try to have a discussion about protecting cultural knowledge. We are interrupted by a neoliberal, tells us there is no point. Someone will steal it for profit. He leaves before we can reply. He shows off his drone to private school friends. He doesn't realise he stands in a midden. 12. Green. I walk with my mother through curated rainforest on Gummingair land. It feels like the first weekend in history. It is the first we are allowed to travel. I walk with my father on Gummingair coast. The winter sun, cool sand and breeze are medicine. Country mothers me and I feel replenished. Towards the end of winter, the drought is breaking on the 6 p.m. news.
Thank you very much for everyone for watching, and thanks to all the guest poets for reading their poems.
Thank you to all the poets for reading. Thank you very much to the Wheeler Centre for supporting this launch. The book is now available to pre-order on the Australian Poetry website. Thank you all very much for tuning in.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and around the world.